add to it. So a quick outline of what I'm going to touch on. I know that I've sent out a couple of the papers that are most specific for this presentation. I'll just start with putting things into context. So the current struggle, climate change, details, how migration dynamics of species work and potential points of resistance. So what's slowing down migration of trees? And why is this research important? So the two papers that I'll be discussing is first chapter of my PhD and the second chapter of my PhD thesis. The first is a controlled setting where I looked at temperature and the effects of temperature on germination rates. And the second was using those same seed origins to conduct a field manipulation study. And then a conclusion, essentially the future, how we're going to use this research and some take-home points. So looking at the high level stuff. So here's some CO2 data from NASA. Essentially the area of interest. That's pretty cool. It doesn't work, but there we go. Use the right end. Essentially, the transition zone is projected by 2100 to increase in temperature from 2 to 7. If you put that in the context of natural disturbances occurring on the landscape, you got to think about drought. You got to think about fire. This I thought was going to delete, but it didn't, so I won't use it in the next slides. There's land use changes. So here's a mine and then the forest on the right. And there's also insect outbreaks. So when you're managing for the forest, you have to use this into context as well as, you know, what's going to happen with climate change. You can see that there's a lot of global overviews, the impact of drought, forest stand growth dynamics, the impacts increasing on forest dynamics. There's all these different facets in play that make managing the forest and even adjusting for forest management strategies very difficult and complex. So we end up like Wile E. Coyote, where we're running off a cliff, and essentially what's going to happen with global warming. So hopefully you guys know this movie. So it's a scene from Rocky IV. It's one of my favorite movies growing up as a kid. So you got Sylvester Stallone or Rocky as the trees, and you got the unbeatable opponent, climate change. So where do scientists play in this? So science is basically Paulie, who's the trainer for Rocky, and we got to observe what trees are doing in the context of climate change. So essentially, the pessimistic view would look at trees, well, they're going to do poorly because they're sessile or they don't move. Basically, they're stuck where they are. Or you could look at, well, there's long regeneration periods. It takes a long time for trees to basically reestablish, so they're hooped. Or localized propagal dispersal, trees don't throw seed very far. So you got to worry about that as well. And what happens if it gets too hot too fast? So basically, trees have to adjust at where they are. Whereas the optimist might take the approach and say, well, trees are highly fecund. So they basically produce a lot of seed and they could basically manage where they are. They have large physical size, so there's a potential to buffer these dynamics in climate, as well as a population size. So if you look at a species like sugar maple, which has a wide distribution, potentially there's a large genetic diversity within that to help manage in uncertainty. And then there's a history of it. So, you know, if you look at the long-term scale, we're talking hundreds of thousands of years, maybe not millions of years, but hundreds of thousands of years, glacial retreat and stuff, trees are there. So let's look at this in terms of migration dynamics and ecotones. So ecotones are essentially the transition zone between one biome to another. So if we look at the temperate forest on the left here, and then that transitions into the mixedwood forest, essentially the ecotone between temperate and boreal forest. And you bring in the particular, I'm happy this is actually working because it didn't work in my defense. Essentially, it replaces itself within the temperate forest. You're going to have temperate trees replacing temperate trees. When it comes to these climatic drivers, essentially you get a mixed bag. Potentially, you know, what habitat specifics, regeneration, localized microsites, you're basically going to get a mixed bag in the mixed zone. And then in the boreal forest, well, what's going on there? How are temperate tree species going to be, you know, regenerating in these forests? We don't know to what extent. And then when you factor in, you know, you got a warmer climate and a cooler climate, what happens when that warmer climate then shifts into the boreal forest? Does that make it enough to actually get recruitment of temperate trees within the boreal zone? So what essentially drives these species migrations? So there's two ways of looking at it. Migration rate could be really fast, or you could be a snail and migrate pretty slowly. So we need to investigate these. So within range resistance, so local adaptation, what's resisting species from migrating? So when it's hot or cold, you put on some shades, you put on some, what do you call it, crème solaire, you know, or when it's cold, you put on your coat. And how do you adjust for this? So when it's cold, you put on, you light a fire, you put on an AC unit. Trees don't have this benefit. So essentially, local adaptation could basically be defined as the patterns and processes observed across local populations of the same species connected, at least potentially by dispersal and gene flow. So when we look at this in the context of species ranges, somebody located in the middle of the range can have input from all different points within that range. Whereas when we get to the limit, you're only getting certain particulars. So there's less diversity at the range limit, potentially. And these are dynamic in time. So you could see a past limit was up here when things were more favorable. A past limit, when things were less favorable, things retreat. When we look at it in the context of future climate projections, species distribution models, here's an example from 2071 to 2100. You got the darker line, which is the current climatic rate of, or climatic niche for sugar maple, and it's projected to be as high as Ungava Bay. So how accurate are these? Anybody? Not very accurate, because if you're gonna have a sugar maple in Ungava Bay, first you need soil, and it's basically rock outcrop. And if you're gonna get to that, you basically have to get past the boreal zone, where there are already trees. So how do you outcompete those trees? Where there aren't sugar maple, are they potentially maladapted to warmer climates? They are well adapted to this middle range, then the transition zone, and then potentially poorly adapted. But how do these changes occur in the future? So that's within range. How about outside resistance? So priority effects. So I already mentioned boreal forest. Those provide priority effects, which occurs when the first species to colonize an area lowers the availability of resources, example, light or space or nutrients, which changes the environment in a way that doesn't allow other species to get in. So could you imagine a sugar maple seedling falling in there, not enough light, not enough resources, not enough nutrition? Things become difficult quite quickly. So this gives the context to why conduct this type of research. That was a full sentence. I'm happy that loaded. Climate change is occurring. However, little is known in terms of the rate and magnitude of which things are changing for trees. So you got to think of migration and adaptation. Excuse me. Studies which focus on these early life history stages, so seed germination and seedling establishment phases, are a key bottleneck. If you're not getting recruitment, you're not getting a forest at the end. So these studies, surprisingly, are very limited. Transition zones. So ecotones are severely undersampled, particularly in terms of population dynamics. If you do a literature search, you're going to see a lot of elevational gradients. So you're going up a mountain, but you won't see very many studies on latitudinal gradients. Does anybody have an answer why? It's hard, and you got to do a lot of driving. So you got to basically drive. You're going to see there's a lot of driving, and to avoid that, you could get around it by going up an elevational gradient. The influence of priority effects. I'm not going to present any of my findings for, let's say, the third chapter, which focused on this, but just keep in mind that the early bird, does it essentially keep the worm? So that's an expression, you know, early bird gets the worm, does it hold on to it? So essentially identifying driving factors and thresholds. If we're able to do this, this will allow us to better manage the forest, or basically allow us to identify what that moving target is and plan accordingly. So where would you begin? First, you got to pick the right species to identify how you could go about doing this. So here's one of the seedlings that, or the seed that I dispersed, and it miraculously germinated in the boreal forest. But this photo tells a lot more. You have some needles over here, you have some grass over there, you have, I'm not sure if it shows up well, but there's some decomposed wood over here. And there's about, I counted it on the plane last night, there's about 12 or 13 ungerminated seeds. So there's one, there's another one over there. This one's the lucky one. So you can see there's a lot of variability within. I think this is about, 12 centimeter, dispersal. So sugar maple, variability within a range. So basically it covers 12.5 million hectares. So it gives you a nice pool to work with. Second, it's sensitive to changes in climate, particularly recruitment. So there's an interest biologically. There's also an economic interest. So high value to end products, timbers and veneers. There's the social aspect, so visual bliss. We don't have this so much in the Abitibi region, but when you go further south, you get the nice colors of spring, or fall, excuse me, spring. I'm excited for spring, it's around the corner. And of course, you have the $200 million maple syrup industry. So that makes things a little sweeter to do that research. So the research itself. So the first study, assessing tree germination resilience to global warming, a manipulative experiment using sugar maple, was published in Seed Science Research. I learned a lot from submitting this paper to that journal. More so than this person learned, define germination is not to become a German citizen. So sugar maple seed. So just to give you some context in terms of the seed and the development, seed ripen essentially at the end of summer. They disperse in late fall, October to December, and then they remain dormant between essentially the entire winter and then germinate from March to May. The seeds remain morphologically mature but dormant embryos. To break this dormancy, these seeds require stratification. Essentially, that means cold and moist conditions. But what happens to those conditions if we warm with the projected 2 to 7 degrees? Think about climate warming. If this happens, what happens to these germination rates? So this led to the, as a good researcher should have, a good hypothesis. Seed origin affects the range of temperature for optimal germination due to local adaptation. First research objective was to identify the optimal incubation temperature across the species range and for each provenance, meaning location, and identify the influence of a warmer or cooling temperature shifts to simulate an earlier or later spring. So this is pretty novel in the sense that if you left the temperature, you're incubating a seed at, let's say, 3 degrees, what would happen if you shifted it to a warmer one during that process? And this is something that is projected to occur with climate change. Much shorter spring conditions, what's going to happen? So this was pretty novel. I think it was my research, but I'm partial, right? Identify the potential change. So using essentially a simulation to assess under future climate change scenarios. So what's happening now versus under a 2 or a 5 or a 7 degree warming. So essentially climate change for this projection. How do we go about this? Collecting seed as far as Tennessee, Kentucky, Pennsylvania, Sherbrooke, Montmagny, Rivière-du-Loup, and Ville-Marie. So basically collecting seed across the entire species range. 28,700 seeds divided up into 100 seed lots, like 100 seeds. So this gave a total of 287 treatments in total. We have 9 constant stratification treatments. So remember I said 30 to 90 days these seeds require. So you have, from each seed source, you have 100 seeds from, let's say, Rivière-du-Loup at 1 degree. Then you have another 100 at 0. Then you have another 100 at that. So automatically you have 900 seeds that are under these constant seed treatments. And then you have 224 shifting treatments. So essentially, these ones are shifted to the warmer climate, and then the warmer climate shifted to the colder climate. So we got to get a very good grasp of what's affecting these seeds. Every week for 90 days, I had to open them up, count the seeds, roll them back up, put them in. So it took a lot. And then we used the survival analysis or a time to event analysis, which allows you to basically decipher, you know, what is the likelihood or the probability of seeds germinating. So what's the results? I'm hoping this is clear, but essentially with the week on the x-axis and y is the probability of not germinating. So you gotta basically flip it. The lower you go, the higher the probability of germinating. Essentially, there's a split between north and south if you look at the top here. So these are the northern or the southern ranges, and here's the northern ranges, and here's the temperature. So these are seed origin, and this is the temperature. Essentially, we found a 38% difference just by seed origin. Overall temperature is negated. So this is the whole kit and caboodle pretty much. So there's an effect by origin. On the bottom, if you go too high, so essentially these are the 11 and 13 constant temperature treatments. You go too high, you're getting fungus, they're not germinating. But you are germinating if you're less than 7 degrees. So if you're between minus 1 and 7, you basically find out where sugar maple can germinate.
Vois-tu, je suis assis sur une conférence à Rouen qui se donne comme.
Thought he knew the slide better than me. So here we have the seed origin. So here's the constant temperature treatment. So essentially the seed stayed at that temperature the entire time versus a warm shift, cool shift. Okay, so essentially what this tells us is that under warm or first cool shifting, if you shift seeds from a warmer to a cooler, you're actually getting an increase in germination. These seeds like cooler temperatures, and that's almost a fifth higher. Seeds actually germinated a week earlier as well. There's an increasingly beneficial aspect for this for northern seeds. So it's showing that there's an adaptation for these cooler climates. It's much higher at the north, and you can see that highlighted here. Interference here. That's okay. Sorry. Yeah, that's okay. So if you're shifting from, let's say, the cooler to the warmer, you're actually going to get a negative effect. So germination was actually reduced 11%. This is overall trends. Again, warmer shifts caused earlier germination. If you minimize the shifting, you keep the shifting within 7 degrees, you're actually going to get a higher germination. Versus if you get it higher than 7 degrees, you're only at 34%. So put this into context of climate change. If you're going to have a really warm spring, you're going to get a reduction in germination. If you have a prolonged spring, much better germination. It keeps that window of 30 to 90 days in that optimal scenario. So minimize the impacts when heated in the southern sources compared with the northern. So these southern sources are actually better adapted to these warmer shifts. Again, I already mentioned this, shifting temperatures is caused earlier germination. So this is probably my favorite slide from this presentation. So future, not saying the rest of the presentation is boring or anything, but future climate change scenarios. So let's look at those seed origins. So this is going to simulate what the average temperature for stratification, now that's the window between March and May, what that average temperature was, and what happens if we actually warm it up at 2 degrees, at 5 degrees, and at 7 degrees. This will tell us what happens to overall temperature or overall germination rates. I think that's all of them. So essentially you're going to see in that middle range, you're starting to get to the basically the edge of what's acceptable for those seeds in those ranges. In Tennessee, you're already warm. It's not making much of a difference. You're so cold in the north, it hasn't affected it yet. What happens if you warm it up 5 degrees? It goes a lot faster when it's not on that, but keeps the suspense up, I guess. So you're starting to see that things are changing. This is becoming a little more impactful, but the rate, you're starting to see the flow is going further north. This is the exciting one. I think it's exciting. We'll find out. So if you're in this eco zone, you're seeing 3/4 of a drop at +7. Now this is just the average. This is average across. Now if you could get higher or you could get lower. But what this illustrates here is things are already pretty crappy in the south. But, you know, they can't get much worse, but they can get a lot worse where most of the trees are. So this was an interesting slide as well. This is mean temperature from 1901 to 2010 in the spring from March to May. And you could see these are the northern ranges. This is Pennsylvania, so basically in the middle. And this is the southern ranges, so Tennessee and Kentucky. You can see that there's variability, but essentially it's basically the same. But when you get into those northern ones, this actually reiterates what's happening. You go further north, the variability is going up. You're seeing much more warming in the northern latitudes than you are in the central latitudes. So this is alarming. This can be very alarming. So in summary for this study, so it's true that seed origin is affected by temperature for the optimal germination. It might be hard to see, but that's a roller coaster basically happening at 7 degrees. Once you get past that optimal temperature of -1 to 7 degrees, things fall off regardless. You need that temperature to be within 7 degrees. Next, best is around freezing. I was actually surprised to find that you can have significantly high germination rates below freezing. So seeds are germinating under the pack of snow. Northern seed provenances are currently the best for germination, but how long is that going to stay? Southern seed provenances are better adapted to warmer shifts. Northern seed provenances are better adapted to cooler shifts, so you can see that local adaptation. And climate warming will significantly influence germination of sugar maple seed, which could slow recruitment and ultimately the migration under climate change. But this is in a lab. So what's going to happen if we go into the field? And this could be mediated, obviously, by some moisture regime to some extent. So you could buffer it some. But like I said, what's happening in the field? What actually is occurring to some extent? So this is a paper that recently got published towards the end of last year, local adaptation of trees at the range margin and how it impacts range shifts in the face of climate change. So the hypothesis was demography at the range limits will be constrained by the local adaptation to the abiotic and biotic environments within the range. So what's occurring within the range will actually limit you from being able to migrate into the boreal. So our predictions for this study were southern seed provenances, or the origins, will be most maladapted to environmental conditions occurring beyond the current northern range. So furthest proximity from the origin. So it was expected that the seeds from Tennessee and Kentucky would do the poorest outside the current range. So basically a provenance or maternal effect. Early seedling establishment will be best within sites which meet the species-specific climate requirements needed to ensure germination. Essentially, does it match that 0 to 7 degrees or -1 to 7 or 5 degrees? So a climate effect, essentially temperature effect. And then once those seedlings established, local conditions resembling what's actually occurring within the range would actually favor higher seedling survival rates. So is there a microsite or neighborhood effect to those survival rates? So 12 sites. So in the orange is the temperate zone. This is the species range. Again, the yellow is the ecotone in Quebec, and the blue is the boreal sites in Quebec. So can anybody guess how far in a distance it would take to actually travel from Montreal, where I was based, to actually go collect and plant all those sites? Any guess? This is why people don't do these kinds of studies. It was about 15,000 kilometers. So it wasn't fun. Well, it was fun, but you know, you got to see a lot of Quebec, which is obviously beautiful. So obviously three forest types, 12 sites, 4 within the temperate zone where sugar maple is, 4 within the mixed wood transition zone, and then 4 within the boreal zone, and then the 6 seed provenances, and then 3 replicates. So this is a cage that I got my dad to help me build. There's 216 cages. So basically these are protecting the seedlings from getting, you know, eaten by granivores, so squirrels coming in and basically taking your study away from you. So I wanted to make sure that that didn't happen. Took a lot of effort, but it was worth it. So this number beats the previous number. So there's 32,400 seeds. So 150 seeds within each plot. I put that picture. That was, I think, at Parin. It was -19, but the real feel, or with humidity, I think it was -42. So we had to go put these cages in there, dump some seeds. So it was a lot of fun. So I'm encouraging you to do some research like this. It was a lot of fun. We also put data loggers. So we were able to identify exactly when snow melts. There's light indicator or a light measurement sensor on there, and there's also temperature. So we were able to actually identify if that temperature requirements were met at each site. And this is what those loggers actually provide you. So the dates on the x-axis and temperatures on the y. You can see that it's pretty flat until you hit about the end of April. And then the temperature increases, and then you have light. So you can actually identify when snow melts and then when the seeds are actually exposed to ambient temperature. And you might ask, why is that flat? It's because you got about 2 feet of snow in some sites. Most of all the sites had snow, but that varied to the degree. Results. So first the macro scale. So stand, so the different biomes, so boreal, mixed, and temperate, and then the provenance effect. So there's a lot of numbers here, so we'll break it down. First, we'll look at this. So boreal, first year, seed germination. So essentially, was there a seedling there? Out of all those seeds in the boreal zone, we got 5% that actually germinated, and there was actually a seedling there. The second year, there was only 1.5%, and then the survival rate is only 11%. So you go back the second year, you see if those seedlings are still there. You're not doing very well. It progressively gets better in the temperate, but what's interesting is these survival rates are all comparable statistically. So it's telling you that within the range that there's factors that are influencing survival rate. Lots of leaves come down. The seedlings, are they strong enough to survive even within their own climate? Versus boreal forest, different ballgame. If we look at first year seedling counts, so this is the number of counts per seedling plot, so each one of those meters squared. These are, first, the ones with B are the boreal, M with mixed wood, temperate. You can see that the first year seedling counts, there's lots of variability here, but essentially, you're basically getting the same impact in the mixed wood as you are in the boreal. Temperate's a little higher because they're much more favorable conditions. This is second year seedling count, and only seed origin was important here. So you can see latitudinal gradient. If you start in the furthest north to the furthest south, you're getting a transition. Yeah, these are high variance. We're doing a lot of different sites, but there is a transition for northern range being much better at establishing in the boreal. So that's reassuring. Keep in mind, compare this to what we found in the lab. You basically have to flip this. This is the southern and that's the northern. It shows the same transition. So things that are happening in the lab are being reiterated in the field. So here's one of those plots after the second year. You could see that this was by luck. I had no idea that the seedling would actually be able to push right through, but it's possible, so it's great. So these worked excellent. They're not copywritten or anything. You could actually build them yourselves and take the credibility for that. So I could help you with that if you'd like. So how do we actually analyze things that are happening at the micro scale? So we basically take all these variables we collected. So soil pH, I'm not going to go through the list, but there's climate variables. There's plot level variables. So we took the percentage of cover within each plot. And then we also took provenance effects. So we looked at mean annual temperature for those, as well as number of degree days, or not number of degree days, but number of frost-free days, a whole whack. And you throw them in something called an MRT, or a multivariate regression tree analysis, which basically tells you where your data basically splits up. I won't get into details. If you'd like to know more, I could fill you in on how to do that. Essentially, it punches out something like this. So this is we did that for each biome. So one for the boreal, one for the mixed wood, one for the temperate. This is for the mixed wood, so it gives you the variability within each. The most important factor is stratification days. So do you have enough days that match the 0 to, I think it's -1 to 7? Or if you have too many, that means that it's staying too cold too long. So if you're over 75 stratification days, you're starting to get into poor germination rate. So if you compare 2% to 13%. And you could split that down to seed weight. If you have a smaller seed, unlikely to germinate. Larger seed, it goes up from 4.6 to 1, and you can see how it's broken down. Softwood was important, soil pH was important, and leaf cover was important. More leaves, better site, 14% versus 10, 33% survival versus 6.6% survival. So you can see which factors are important within the mixed wood forest. It's a mosaic, remember. So mixed wood transition, you're having temperate, you're having boreal. If you have more temperate factors, you're going to have more temperate recruitment. Seed specific, so provenance. This was a slide that I put together real quick, but essentially this is the end of frost-free period. It's cut off by the recording thing, but essentially the shorter the frost-free period, the warmer it gets earlier, the better weight for a seed you're going to have, higher recruitment. And here is basically the mean seed lot weight. So 150 seeds, what's the average weight? You could see that outside of Kentucky and the southern rate, Tennessee, basically at the northern rate, there's not much variance. Yes, they're statistically different, but they're basically in the same ballpark. So you could tell that the seed currently that's available for sugar maple, the best locations are in the north. So in summary, demography is constrained by local adaptation to these abiotic and biotic environments occurring within the range. Yes, there is poor recruitment from the southern provinces, but comparable survival. So if you're able to establish, you're basically on the right path. So obviously, if you're not going to match those species-specific thresholds, you're not going to germinate. You're not going to survive. Upon seedling establishment, as I showed in the MRT analysis, local microsite conditions more closely resembling where you come from, you're more likely to do better. So this was a conceptual figure that I threw in the end of my thesis, and when I reflected on it, it starts to get to where you want to go in terms of how complex recruitment actually is. It's not like you're throwing seed on the ground and things germinate. You have to consider a whole bunch of things. So it's going to be hard to see, but there's a little star by the things that I actually considered in my study. You got microsite, seed stratification, you have seed dispersal, seed development, but you miss a lot of other things that could potentially be in play here. Phenology, when a bud breaks, when the seed actually produces, pollination, seed predation, I blocked. So you could imagine 11% germination, 11% survival, but that could essentially be 0 if you got a bunch of squirrels coming through. So you got to keep this in mind. Herbivory, just because the seed was there, it germinated, 2 years from now, there could be something that eat it. So essentially parent tree to seed, there's all these factors. Seed to seedling, there's a bunch of factors that basically take out a bunch of numbers. Seedling to sapling, then you got growth and competition, and you got to worry about all these other factors. Things get crazy, and you want to basically let the forest do what it wants, right? And then you got adaptation and priority effects you got to consider as well. Very complex stuff. So when you break it down, it's not actually just seed. So I showed in the first couple of slides what's happening with migration dynamics. Just throw some seed, trees come up. But essentially, it's this figure. You got to worry about all these things. And oh, there's actually a transition. It's supposed to be nicer. There's all these things you got to take into consideration, and these thresholds you got to not worry about, but you got to be conscious of. So there's a lot of things in play, which make it difficult to extrapolate in the grander scheme. So where does this put us? Is sugar maple going to migrate into the boreal? So let's put it into context. So remember this figure here, the future climate envelope. Yeah, the climate might be better in the north. Petty and al. in 2014 said that sugar maple, in order to maintain this flow or migration rate, it would essentially have to migrate 4.9, basically 5 kilometers a year. What does that mean? It means basically the seeds in Ferme-Neuve have to basically reach Chibougamau in 100 years, or just about. So 411 kilometers, that translates to. But if we consider the temporal factors to consider, it typically takes a sugar maple tree about 30 years in the ideal setting to actually produce seed. Now, if it's also a masting species, so that means that every so often it produces a huge number of seedlings, and some years it produces very little. So that's every 3 to 8 years. So essentially one cycle to actually produce a tree could take upwards of 68 years. So that's essentially leaves 16 to 51 years, if you go by the variability, to travel the remaining 406 kilometers in the best case scenario. So if you've ever driven in Montreal, expect delays, significant delays. There's another slide and it's delayed. Delayed, good timing. So how do we actually speed things up? What's our options in terms of if we really want to have things aligned? You know, you could use assisted migration where you actually take the seed and you go, or you plant the seedling to avoid the seedling establishment phase and all that, and go plant the species where they need to be. The risk of doing that is just because they're supposed to be there, you got to still worry about the variability. It's still cold in Abitibi, you know, it's still cold in Baie-Comeau. Just because it's supposed to be there on average doesn't mean it's going to be there every year. You could implement forest management strategies that actually favor temperate species, or you could worry about natural disturbances that remove priority effects. So you got to think, how's a sugar maple actually going to go into the boreal where there's, you know, balsam fir already established? You got to basically wipe out the forest there, and that could happen with fire or insect outbreaks or a big windstorm. So these remove the priority effects to allow sugar maple to get in there if it wants to, right? Or if it needs to. So there's a whole whack of research that should basically get to better identifying these different thresholds. You know, you could do species-specific thresholds, which was done in the first, identifying what temperature regime, but you could also do moisture. You could do all these studies. Well, if it's this moist, how does that influence germination? You could do transplant studies, isolation studies for potential future scenarios, assess the variability. I only did 12 sites. You could probably do 50 if you had enough gas in your truck. Genetics, you know, edaphic effects, so soil effects, you know, those are big issues. Just because the trees on there are different doesn't mean the soil conditions and nutrients are there. And longer term studies are needed, but keep in mind we're dealing with a finite time scale. So take home messages. Species ranges are dynamic and changing all the time. A comment, you know, it's easy to say this, basically everything matters. You know, you got maternal effects, you got climatic effects, you have local neighborhood drivers. Essentially everything, upon everything can control germination and seedling establishment, but timing is important. It really depends on timing. I think I mentioned this a few times, things are very complex and they're not isolated. It's often overlooked that recruitment is, you know, you think, oh, okay, there's a forest there, but there was a lot of losers in that to actually get those trees. Recruitment is the linchpin to basically your forest and species migration as a whole. Seed dispersal is limited, you know, and so are the favorable recruitment sites. So just because the seed lands over there doesn't mean it's actually going to germinate. There's a lot of factors to consider. The competition through priority effects. Sugar maple has locally adapted seeds and could face maladaptation under rapid climate change or rapid warming. So expect migration rates. They could severely be restricted in latitudinal shifts without these canopy openings. So improving those site conditions. I threw this in at the end. If you don't like where you are, move. You're not a tree. And without deviation from the norm, progress is not possible, but essentially migration is impossible. And that's basically the presentation. So I hope you guys enjoyed that. So thank you very much for listening.
Merci pour la présentation. Je me demandais, est-ce qu'il y a des études semblables qui ont été faites pour d'autres espèces? Est-ce que l'érable à sucre est un peu une espèce typique ou d'autres espèces vont plus facilement migrer? Est-ce qu'il y a d'autres études qui sortent qui permettent de comparer?
Je viens d'avoir une invitation pour un review de littérature sur un couple d'espèces temporaires qui étaient transplantées en Newfoundland. Il y a beaucoup des autres espèces, mais il y a d'autres facteurs en termes de germination. Donc, il y a 2 ou 3 papiers que je peux dire, oui, il a fait un semblant de recherche que ça, mais c'est des autres facteurs que température en termes de stratification.
Mais donc, tu t'attends que si on se pose les mêmes questions pour d'autres espèces, la réponse peut être totalement différente.
Exact. Donc, si tu fais ça sur sapin et baumière, ça va être... peut-être tu veux faire l'inverse. Tu plantes sapin dans le sud pour voir comment ça va réagir en termes de changement climatique dans le nord. Ça, c'est pas une chose que, avant de faire cette recherche, ça pourrait être bien clairvoyant, en termes de ça va être quoi dans 50 ans? On peut le faire tout de suite.
Vous avez une question?
Oui.
Ben, pour que l'érable à sucre puisse aller un peu plus vers le nord, il faut que les conditions soient favorables,
oui.
Mais aussi il faut que l'espèce puisse y trouver de la place. Est-ce que pensez-vous que, par exemple, un peu plus au nord, les espèces qui s'y trouvent, par exemple les épinettes, etc., ne vont pas développer des résiliences, des stratégies de résilience pour mieux s'adapter au changement climatique et que ça pourrait peut-être freiner à l'avancée de l'érable à sucre?
J'espère pour les épinettes, il va être capable d'adapter au changement climatique. Mais je pense que c'est l'épinette blanc que son threshold de température, je pense, en été, c'est après 7 ou 8 degrés, je pense, ça commence à baisser. Donc, c'est vraiment... Ils aiment ça le froid. C'est pour ça qu'ils sont là. C'est des conditions froides, puis ça marche, c'est plus acidique. C'est vraiment... Donc, ça, c'est une bonne question à part. Comment ça va changer le boréal? Ça va sécher ou ça va être plus humide?
Si les conditions changent, ça va changer pour toutes les espèces. Mais les espèces qui se trouvent un peu plus au nord, peut-être qu'elles vont s'adapter, elles vont développer des stratégies pour résister.
Certainement.
Est-ce que cela ne va pas contrer un peu l'avancée des autres espèces qui se trouvent un peu plus au sud?
Ça, c'est certain. Ça, c'est les effets prioritaires que j'ai parlé. C'est vraiment, si ça n'adapte pas, les espèces dans le nord, si ça adapte bien, c'est un vice qui tient. Ça va prendre une perturbation qui rentre d'enlever ça pour avoir une migration vers la nord. Il y avait un des étudiants au temps que j'ai fait mon doctorat, il a fait une maîtrise en termes de ça va être quoi les changements c'est en train de faire pour avoir un genre de time scale pour voir ça va prendre combien de temps pour se rendre dans Montréal, puis ça prend dans son modèle, ça dit 10 000 années, 10 000 années pour se rendre au écotone puis s'avancer.
Je vois tout de suite, tu as montré la vitesse d'avancement de l'érable à sucre, c'est pas 4 points et combien.
Ça, c'est juste pour se rendre avec le même, la même rapidité de climat. Ça, les graines, ça pousse 100 mètres. Le plus loin ça va, c'est un couple de 100 mètres. Donc, tu ne vas pas loin avec un couple de 100 mètres chaque 60 ans. C'est difficile.
C'est intéressant, merci Kevin. Là, tu prends pour acquis qu'il y a 0 érable à sucre déjà dans le boréal.
Ouais.
Et pourtant, on sait que c'est déjà là par endroit. Est-ce que tu peux parler de comment tu penses que ça va changer le scénario pour l'érable à sucre, prenant en compte qu'il y a des peuplements isolés déjà dans le nord?
Oui. Bien, en Abitibi, il y a j'ai travaillé dans ce peuplement-là, puis d'après moi, c'est isolé. Ça, c'est pour une raison, parce que c'est les effets dans ce peuplement, c'est vraiment isolé, puis C'est favorable pour ces érables-là. Mais ça va prendre la compétition pour être plus large dans ces peuplements-là. Donc, c'est difficile à dire. C'est don't start tapping those trees, maybe, you know? Je ne sais pas de la réponse. Ça, c'est difficile. Ouais.
Une question complémentaire, en fond. Nous, dans la norme FSC, ils nous demandent justement d'identifier ces peuplements isolés-là.
Ouais.
Nos stratégies nous demandent de les préserver parce que c'est à partir de... C'est présumé que c'est à partir de ces populations-là isolées qui vont se disperser, dans le fond,
Oui.
pour assurer la migration. Est-ce que
ça.
tu penses que c'est une bonne stratégie d'aménagement comme tel?
Ça dépend de combien de nombre des arbres dans ce peuplement-là. Ça dépend. Parce que si un feu rentre, voilà, t'es fini. Il y a une raison que ces peuplements-là sont là. Oui, c'est une bonne façon de gérer la forêt par rapport des types de peuplements. Je pense qu'il y a un effet, c'est complémentaire. Tu veux ces populations dans... Tu veux. Mais comment ça va rester, ça, c'est une autre question.
Basé sur tes recherches, est-ce que tu penses que la distribution courante de l'érable et sucre est une bonne réflexion de son vrai enveloppe climatique? À quel point la distribution courante est en lien avec le climat, son vrai climat? Parce que ça, c'est une des choses qu'on dit. On prend sa distribution maintenant, on regarde le climat là, puis on le projette dans le futur.
Ouais.
Mais rien à dire que où il est maintenant est vraiment in sync avec
Exact.
sa vraie...
C'est ça.
Alors, comment est-ce que ce concept-là va affecter ce que tu as présenté, puis qu'est-ce que tes résultats disent par rapport à ça?
C'est une bonne indication parce que vraiment, il y a bien plus d'espace dans l'aire de répétition, bien sûr, distribution. Il y a des places que le fait de species spécifique pour le moins 1 à 5 degrés, ça existe que le rabbit sucre n'est pas là. Ça, c'est certain. Donc, il y a des autres effets de compétition avec les autres espèces. Peut-être dans le nord, ne sont pas là. Donc, c'est vraiment de compétition, des effets environnementaux qui ça change, ça dépend exactement le spot que tu fais la recherche. Parce que vraiment, la variabilité dans les 4 sites que j'ai faits, tu en as des error bars, des variances sont grands. Donc, tu sais, chaque année, ça va changer. Chaque espèce, ça va changer. Donc, c'est vraiment complexe. La nature, c'est quelque chose de vraiment spécial. Ouais. I didn't really answer your question, I don't think.
J'ai une question en ligne. Alors, c'est Elodie Betembo qui nous demande: les prédictions ont-elles été obtenues grâce à d'autres études? Sinon, quel outil avez-vous utilisé pour les faire? Merci.
La prédiction de... je pense que c'est la prédiction pour... Ça va être le... Peut-être pour poser si c'est bien celui-là. Je pense que c'est pour celui-là. Il y a un tableau dans le premier papier que c'est celui-là. Il y a un tableau que j'ai pris la température moyenne de la région. Donc, le place qu'on a recruté les graines, les semences, on a pris la moyenne température pour mars à mai dans cette région-là. Donc, c'est vraiment ce qui arrive. Je n'ai pas pris les données d'une autre étude. C'est vraiment le climat dans cette région-là. Puis, j'ai fait un ajustement. J'ai ajouté 2 degrés là-dessus. Puis, il commence à changer en termes de cette dispo-là. Donc, si tu es déjà à 5.6, si tu vas à 7.6, tu es où dans le figure? Donc, ça m'a donné une prédiction pour la température à des hauts niveaux. Je pense à répondre à l'autre question. J'espère que c'est correct, ça. Ah. Merci. D'autres questions?
Je me pose la question, au Québec, on a quand même un grand réseau de placettes permanentes.
Ouais.
Mettons, je ne sais pas si ça aurait pu être je sais pas, une méthodologie comparative d'analyser qu'est-ce qu'il y a comme recrutement.
Exact.
Et comment que ça se disperse géographiquement, dans le fond? Est-ce que ça aurait pu être une approche?
C'est bien une approche. Je pense bien il y a beaucoup d'études dans le labo d'Aménagement. On utilise les placettes permanentes du ministère pour faire des prédictions pour le futur. Ces 12 placettes-là, c'est un parti de recette. C'est déjà un placette. Un placette pour la recherche. Il y a 50 placettes comme ça, 55 autour de là. Donc, j'ai utilisé celui-là. Donc, c'est le réseau de ministère avec les placettes permanentes. Ça, c'est certain un bon contexte pour ça.
J'ai une autre question en ligne. Alors, il y a Simon qui demande, vous avez parlé beaucoup de la migration de l'érable à sucre vers le nord à la limite supérieure de sa distribution, mais qu'en est-il de sa potentielle dispersion dans la partie sud de sa distribution? Il fait référence, entre autres, à la diapositive avec les pourcentages de germination par augmentation de température avec les prédictions. Alors, qu'en est-il de la disparition du sud de sa distribution?
Oui, je ne me souviens pas le nom, mais il y avait une étude qui a fait le sud du érable à sucre, puis c'était vraiment le limite ou le facteur qui limitait la distribution par le sud, c'était des nombres de journées stratification trop élevés. Donc, c'était trop sec pour avoir des taux de germination dans le sud. Donc, ça, j'ai trouvé ça pour le sud. Donc, c'était vraiment complémentaire. Je pense que ça va être correct pour une réponse pour celui-là. D'autres questions? Merci à vous.